Sinan Aral, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, guys. It's an honor to be here, a true pleasure. What a fantastic lineup. Thank you to all of the organizers for having me and for all of you who are listening. Just want to give you a very brief overview of something that I'm quite proud of that I've just finished, which is my very first book called The Hype Machine, which details the last 20 years of my scientific research. I started researching social media before Facebook was founded, and I've been researching it ever since. Even then, when I began in early 2000, 2001, I had an idea that this kind of technology could be incredibly disruptive, that it could have tremendous promise and hold the potential for tremendous peril. And I think that a lot of us are now realizing just how powerful it is, its impacts on our democracy, our elections, our economies, our businesses, and even our health, our mental health, but also other types of health. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that I cover in this book, and really go into detail into the science of what's going on under the hood of social media and what we can do about it. So the first place that everybody starts is obviously democracy. We are 6 months from possibly the most consequential election in the United States in our lifetime. And we are approaching that election in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of understandable and justifiable social protest around police brutality. And we know that in the last election, there was a tremendous amount of foreign interference in the US election. So in 2016, Russia sent misinformation to disrupt the election to 126 million people on Facebook, 20 million people on Instagram. They sent 10 million tweets at least, and provided 43 hours worth of YouTube content in the month just before the election in 2016. The bad news is that in 2020, the problem is potentially even more severe now than it was in 2016. And that's because we have other countries that are beginning to interfere in our election, including China and Iran. We are going towards the election in the midst of a global pandemic and a tremendous amount of civil unrest. We had primary elections in Georgia just the other day where there were 4-hour lines for people to vote. And we know that the foreign interference and the attacks are just becoming more sophisticated. So our intelligence community has reported that Russia has moved its servers from outside of the United States to inside of the United States because our surveillance capabilities are less capable domestically than they are on foreign soil. We know that Russia has infiltrated Iran's cyber war department, perhaps to launch attacks that make it seem like they come from Iran rather than from Russia. So things are more sophisticated, more actors, and a lot more confusion during a very consequential election year where a lot of things are hanging in the balance. But it's not just about democracy and elections that social media has an impact. In April 2013, the AP put out this tweet, which said, "Breaking, 2 explosions in the White House and Barack Obama has been injured." This tweet was retweeted 4,000 times in about 5 minutes and went viral thereafter. But it wasn't a true tweet. It was a false tweet that was propagated by Syrian hackers that had hacked the AP Twitter handle. And the problem with this is that we have systems of automated trading algorithms that are designed to sense the sentiment in social media and then to make buy-sell recommendations to institutional investors based on that social media sentiment. So this tweet and it going viral, it's a pretty big event. If the president had been injured in the White House, it triggered trading algorithms to trade on this sentiment and actually sent the stock market crashing wiping out $140 billion in equity value in a matter of minutes. This is one tweet, one moment in time, but imagine the trillions of tweets that are happening all over the world all the time, and the economic impacts on business are also quite large. It's not just about democracy. And it's not just about democracy, elections, and business, but it has everything also to do with our health. So as we are experiencing this difficult global pandemic, we know that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation that is affecting health outcomes, that is affecting public health diplomacy between the countries that should be coordinating with one another, China, Europe, and the United States. And if you think that COVID misinformation is the first time we have public health misinformation, memories are very short, because just last year, we know that there was a tremendous wave of misinformation that was related perhaps to vaccine hesitancy in the United States. We know, for instance, that measles was essentially eradicated or eliminated in the United States in the year 2000. In 2010, there were 63 cases of measles in the United States. In 2019, in just the first 6 months of the year, there were 1,250 cases of measles in the United States. And we know that Facebook ads targeting communities like Clark County in Washington, like Rockland County in New York, were bought on Facebook and other social media sites to spread, for instance, anti-vaccine content, a lot of which has been debunked as false. And so it also is related to our public health and to our mental health, how it affects our loneliness, our depression, and so on. And in this book, I go into great detail outlining each of these potential perils of social media. And so all of these perils are rooted in the wave of social media that has sort of swept the globe in essentially the last decade. If you think about it, just 10 years ago, we really only had, or maybe 15 years ago, the phone, the fax machine, and email to communicate with one another. But in a very short span of time, we have all become very heavy users of social media with these tremendous consequences. But social media doesn't just have the potential for peril. There's also a tremendous amount of promise in social media. When the 8.2 magnitude earthquake hit Nepal in 2015, Facebook not only activated its safety check feature that notified millions of people of the safety of their family members in and around the earthquake, but while Europe donated $3 million to the relief efforts and the United States donated $10 million, Facebook spun up a Donate Now button, which generated $15.5 million of relief effort from 770,000 people in 175 countries, which gives you the sense of the scale of the positive things that can be done with this technology as well. It's certainly an organizing tool for civil expression and demonstration. Now we're seeing in the important Black Lives Matter movement, but we've seen in the snow revolution in Russia, we've seen in Tahrir Square and in Hong Kong. And I go into detail in the book about both the strengths and the weaknesses of social media used for this kind of organizing. Another great example, a very silly meme. Douse yourself with ice water, a bucket of ice water, raised the ice bucket challenge, obviously, raised $250 million for ALS research in 8 weeks. As an economist, we do research on the economic impacts of these types of technologies, and through incredibly innovative research, estimating the consumer surplus generated by the free product that Facebook alone provides, It's been estimated that it generates about $370 billion of consumer surplus in the United States in a single year for a free product. And you can imagine what that means globally. It creates opportunities to build and run small businesses. It creates social capital. It creates economic opportunity. I certainly lead with the peril that can be caused by social media, but I try to remind us of the tremendous promise that also exists in social media. I will note that we are currently experiencing what I call the COVID 180, which is that before the pandemic hit, social media was a pariah. We had, the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. We had Sacha Baron Cohen at the Anti-Defamation League calling social media the greatest propaganda machine in history. We had the Delete Facebook movement. All of these are very valid criticisms of social media, but social media was a pariah before the pandemic. But once we were sheltered in and everyone scurried off the streets and logged on to get online, Facebook, Twitter, and the rest broke records every day. And we realized how essential they were for the information that we were getting, for the human connection that we had to our friends and family, for the informativeness, the health information, and so on. What this demonstrates is that right now we are at a crossroads with social media about how we use it, how we design it, how we regulate it. And we're at a crossroads between privacy, free speech, truth, democracy, and true human connection on one hand, and insecurity, hate speech, falsity, authoritarian tendencies, and political polarization through filter bubbles that Cass Sunstein was talking about just a second ago on the other hand. And the next 18 to 24 months of how we regulate and deal with social media is going to be essential to where we end up as a global society. So in order to understand how we can harness the technology for the promise and avoid the peril, I go under the hood of social media and really describe 20 years of not just my own, but the general science on social media, beginning with how it evolved from the technology trifecta of the emergence and sweeping of the globe of digital social networks, smartphones, and investments in machine intelligence that run the algorithms of social media. And then I go into exactly how it is that social media hooks us. First, neurologically. So I go into the social science, the neuroscience of how social media affects our brains. There is a common, in cultural anthropology and in cognitive anthropology, there is a hypothesis known as the social brain hypothesis, which has gained a ton of evidence over the last 10 years, which basically argues that human beings are as advanced and intelligent as they are, and our brains have evolved not because of our manual dexterity or our ability to have logical reasoning skills, but because of our sociality, our ability to compute and understand complex social organization and situations. Now, if you have a belief that any of that is possible, that really our social evolution has determined our brain's evolution, then the invention of social media, which essentially puts us in direct contact with trillions of social signals every day, you can imagine is like tossing a lit match into a pool of gasoline, because our brains were built for social media, or more appropriately, social media was built for our brains. So I describe how it affects our brains, our mental health, and our kids. But then as an economist, I go into the economics of social media and the underlying market structure, the concept of network effects and local network effects, and what that means for how we should regulate social media, but also what that means for questions like, why is it that Facebook beat MySpace? And it has everything to do with network effects, local network effects, and their go-to-market strategy, which really harness this like we've never seen before. And I also go into the technical aspects of the design of the systems, how they lock us in to technical walled gardens and what we can do about it. Now, a lot of people think about social media as sort of imposing peril upon us. But I think that that kind of technological determinism absolves us from our own responsibility in this process, which is to say that essentially human beings have a very important role to play in what happens next to our society, whether it's polarization or the impacts on our democracy, or whether it's about the public health impacts or the economic impacts of this technology. And the reason for that is because the core process that determines the outcomes from social media in our society is what I call the hype loop, which is the dynamic interplay of machine intelligence and human behavior. What happens in social media is that machine learning algorithms ingest everything that we do, who we friend, what we read, what we buy, and it learns our preferences. And then it makes suggestions for who we should friend next, what we should read next, and through advertising and other types of nudges, what we should buy next or who we should vote for next. And if you think about this from a human evolution perspective, even who we should date next, and therefore how humanity may evolve in general. You may be surprised to hear that relationships born of the algorithms on social dating sites surpassed face-to-face meeting and or friend introductions for how relationships are formed in 2013. So 7 years ago, algorithms overtook face-to-face introductions for how we choose our mates in society. But the hype loop, the interplay of machine intelligence and human behavior, includes not just the suggestions and the machine intelligence of making those suggestions, but also how we consume those suggestions and act, what we choose to read, who we choose to friend, what we choose to share. So the design of these systems and our own decision making has a lot to do with what happens next. I also describe in the book how we can affect change, how we can approach this crossroads of social media that we sit at and ensure the promise and avoid the peril. And that really boils down to 4 categories of lever that we have, which are money, code, norms, and laws. Money being the incentives driving the business models of the platforms, code being the design of the algorithms and the platforms themselves, norms being what we accept as socially responsible behavior on social media, how we decide to act on social media, and laws, how we regulate social media. Should Facebook be broken up? Should Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act be repealed or be given to the FCC? For instance, the new Trump executive order. How should speech be regulated online? How should political speech be regulated? How should we deal with misinformation? All of these are addressed one by one in the book. Right now, we are at this crossroads thinking about how we should regulate, for instance, Facebook and other social media. Should they be broken up? Would that solve misinformation or privacy problems? And we have multiple different privacy regimes in the world. We have China, which is essentially using social media to surveil users of social media. And we have very large Chinese social media apps like WeChat that are in the global marketplace. We have Europe, which takes a completely different viewpoint through the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that essentially protects privacy very strictly. And then we have the United States in the middle trying to do trying to decide what it's going to do next on privacy. Currently, we have a patchwork of state-by-state privacy legislation led by California, but we are likely to implement federal legislation in the coming years and considering how to do that well is incredibly important. We've written at length, for instance, in Science Magazine here, an article about how we protect our elections from social media manipulation. And I cover that also in great detail in the book. The main point of the book, the main message, if there's just one to distill from the book, is that we can achieve the promise of the wisdom of our collective intelligence through this technology that we have developed in social media, while avoiding the peril for our democracies, for our economies, and for our public health. But in order to do that, we have to take a rigorous scientific look under the hood of how all of this works with regard to the economics, the technical design, the sociology of social media. And by doing that, I try to answer the question, how can we, and how must we adapt to this technology to achieve the promise while avoiding the peril? The Hype Machine is available for pre-order now. I really look forward to a discussion, both now at Nudgestock, but into the future with many of you who I hope to see in person soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Terrific. Now, a quick question on that. When you look at remedies or guides like money, code, norms, and laws, how on earth can we get buy-in to any change? Because it seems that fact-checking doesn't work, because if the fact-checking says what I choose to believe is false, I now blame the fact-checkers. If you even have artificial intelligence with GAN networks creating humans that don't exist, but they resonate with me, I get pissed off when you tell me that they're not real. So how do you regulate this when those who will feel regulated against will always protest and never buy in?
So, Chris, great question. I think, as with any of these questions, the devil is in the details and in the science. So, recent scientific research is, in fact, showing just the opposite. Accuracy nudges get people to believe false news less, get people to share false news less. And when people label false news themselves, they get into a mentality of thinking critically about the information that they are consuming. And therefore, there are promising leads in the science about how we can deal with it. When I gave my TED talk in TEDx CERN talk in 2018 about false news, about that article that you described at the beginning of this session, I suggested labeling as an important possible way of dealing with the false news crisis. What we're seeing now is we're seeing divergent policies at the platforms on this. We're seeing Twitter label things more. We're seeing Facebook not label things. And we're seeing the scientific results indicate that labeling can have a meaningful effect on depressing the spread of false news and getting people to believe and share it less to begin with, addressing both sides of the hype loop.
And even the labeling creates some polarization, because we seem not to have, at least in the US anymore, any independent adjudicators who are trusted by all, even if they come at a conclusion that you don't like. Last question here. Some on Slido have asked about, who are the most impactful messengers of fake news? And I might twist that around the opposite way. And you think about your work and Duncan Watts. Is it more that who are the most gullible and susceptible? Because there is a certain bullshit receptivity, as it's been called in behavioral science as a technical term. Do you think it's about effective messengers, or more about that dry tinder ready to burn?
It's funny, we've done research on influence and susceptibility in networks, as you know, and the answer is it's both. It is both working in concert that develops this problem. We have seen, for instance, that in terms of the susceptibility side, people who score high on critical thinking are less likely to be susceptible. So I think that there are some important avenues, for instance, for digital literacy. Teaching our kids to be critical consumers of information is important, and influence is also very important. And in the book, I describe many different factors that create influence in social media.
Sinan, we thank you, and definitely we're going to grab the book, tear into it, and come back at you with even harder questions. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.